A Japanese intelligence officer sat down in late 1943 with a stack of captured American maintenance logs. He studied the numbers for a long time. Then he sent a report back to Tokyo saying the figures had to be wrong. They weren't wrong. The numbers showed that American squadrons in the Pacific were keeping more than 80% of their aircraft operational at any given time. Japanese units, working with more mechanics per plane, were lucky to hit 50%. The officer couldn't explain the gap. Neither could anyone else in Tokyo. That gap would help decide the war. It didn't come from better tools. It didn't come from more men. It came from a system so fundamentally different from Japan's approach that Japanese ground crews were essentially looking at a foreign language and calling it a typo. Understanding that system means going back to before the war even started, to a decision made in a peacetime hangar that most people have never heard of. In the late 1930s, the United States Army Air Corps was facing a problem. Aircraft were getting faster, more complex, and harder to fix. Each new generation of engines brought new failure points. Each new airframe brought new inspection requirements. And the traditional way of managing aircraft maintenance, where mechanics simply fixed things when they broke, was starting to collapse under its own weight. A broken plane on the ground wasn't just a broken plane. It was a pilot without a mount, a mission that couldn't launch, a gap in a formation that the enemy could exploit. The Air Corps needed a better way. What they built was called progressive maintenance. The idea sounds simple in hindsight, but it was radical at the time. Instead of waiting for something to fail, American ground crews worked on a rotating schedule. Every aircraft had a fixed cycle. At regular intervals, specific systems got inspected, lubricated, adjusted, or replaced, whether they seemed to need it or not. The work was divided into phases, so that at any given moment, most of the fleet was either flying or in a short, predictable maintenance window. Japanese doctrine worked on the opposite assumption. Fix it when it breaks. Keep it flying until it can't fly anymore. Then repair it. That approach felt efficient. You weren't spending labor on things that weren't broken yet, but it created a hidden cost that compounded over time. When a Japanese plane broke down, the repair was often complex. Systems that had been running past their ideal service interval didn't fail cleanly. They failed catastrophically. A bearing that should have been replaced at 300 hours might survive to 400 hours, and then take a connecting rod and 2 other components with it when it finally gave out. American mechanics, by contrast, rarely saw that kind of cascading failure. They pulled components before they reached the edge. The repairs stayed small, fast, and predictable. That predictability was everything. When a squadron commander knew that each aircraft would be out of service for 36 hours every 2 weeks on a fixed schedule, he could plan around it. He could stagger the cycles so that a quarter of his planes were in maintenance on any given day while the rest flew. He always knew what he had available. He never got surprised. Japanese squadron commanders were always getting surprised. A Japanese unit might have 20 aircraft on paper. But on the morning of a planned operation, the actual count of flyable planes could be anywhere from 8 to 18. Maintenance officers couldn't tell you which planes would be ready tomorrow. They could only tell you which planes were broken today. That uncertainty had a name in logistics circles. It was called operational readiness drag. And it didn't just affect the number of planes in the air, it infected everything downstream. Mission planning, pilot rotation, fuel allocation, spare parts ordering. Every decision made on bad information produced worse outcomes than decisions made on no information at all. Here's where the gap started to widen into a gulf. The United States Army Air Forces, the renamed and expanded successor to the Air Corps, didn't just implement progressive maintenance. They institutionalized it. They wrote it into training manuals. They built it into the curriculum at every technical school. They promoted crew chiefs based partly on their unit's readiness rates. Readiness rates. That metric alone tells you something important about how differently the two air forces thought about the maintenance problem. The Army Air Forces tracked operational readiness the way a business tracks revenue. Every group, every squadron, every individual aircraft had a readiness number attached to it. Commanders reported up the chain of command on those numbers weekly. Poor numbers got noticed. Consistently, poor numbers got investigated. Japanese maintenance culture had no equivalent system. There was no standard metric for operational readiness across the Imperial Japanese Navy Air Service or the Imperial Japanese Army Air Service. Units reported aircraft as available or unavailable based on internal assessments that varied from airfield to airfield. There was no way to compare performance across units, no way to identify which practices worked better, no way to spread good ideas from one squadron to the next. That institutional invisibility meant that even when a Japanese ground crew stumbled onto a better technique, it stayed local. It didn't travel. American innovations traveled fast. When mechanics at one base figured out that pre-staging spare parts for the most common failure points cut turnaround time by a third, that information moved through the technical training pipeline within months. When a crew chief at another base developed a faster method for inspecting the Pratt & Whitney R2800 engine's ignition harness, the technique appeared in revised maintenance procedures across the Pacific. The Pratt & Whitney R2800. That engine deserves its own moment here. It powered the Grumman Hellcat, the Vought Corsair, and the Republic Thunderbolt, three of the most important American combat aircraft of the Pacific and European theaters. The R2800 was an 18-cylinder, air-cooled radial engine producing around 2,000 horsepower. It was also, by the standards of the era, extraordinarily reliable. But it wasn't reliable by accident. Pratt & Whitney designed the R2800 with maintenance access built into its architecture. Key service points were reachable without removing adjacent components. Cylinder replacement, one of the most common field repairs on radial engines, could be done by a two-man crew in a matter of hours on the R2800. The same job on some Japanese engines required partial disassembly of surrounding systems and could take the better part of a day. That design philosophy reflected a broader American industrial assumption. The plane would spend as much of its life being serviced as being flown, so the service had to be fast. Japanese engine design made the opposite trade. Performance at the point of manufacture was prioritized over ease of service in the field. The Nakajima Sakai engine that powered the Mitsubishi Zero was in many ways a marvel, lightweight, powerful for its displacement, smooth running at altitude. It was also difficult to work on, sensitive to improper handling, and unforgiving when a mechanic made a mistake under field conditions. A Zero sitting in the jungle mud at Rabaul was a different machine than a Zero sitting in the manufacturer's facility at Musashino. The gap between ideal conditions and field conditions was something Japanese engineers hadn't fully accounted for. American engineers had obsessed over it. This brings up the second piece of the puzzle, the one the Japanese intelligence officer couldn't see in those captured logs, even if he'd known to look for it. Training pipelines. The United States military ran its aviation mechanics through a standardized training program before they ever touched a combat aircraft. The Army Air Force's Technical Training Command processed hundreds of thousands of men through specialized schools across the country. Keesler Field in Mississippi, Chanute Field in Illinois, Lowry Field in Colorado. Each school focused on specific aircraft systems, engines, airframes, instruments, hydraulics, electrical systems. Graduates arrived at operational units knowing exactly what they were doing on their primary aircraft type. They didn't learn on the job. The job was where they applied what they'd already learned. Japanese mechanics often did learn on the job. The Imperial Services trained mechanics, but the pipeline was narrower, less standardized, and harder to scale. As the war ground on and experienced ground crews were lost to Allied bombing, disease, and the general attrition of a losing campaign, replacement mechanics arrived with less preparation. American replacement mechanics arrived at roughly the same level of preparation as the men they replaced, because the training system was consistent. That consistency compounded over time in a way that's almost mathematical. A unit that maintains its skill level through a long campaign performs at the same rate in 1945 that it did in 1942. A unit that degrades, as Japanese units did, performs worse with each passing month, even if the aircraft and tools stay the same. By mid-1944, the gap was visible in combat results in ways that went beyond pilot skill. At the Battle of the Philippine Sea in June 1944, the engagement American pilots called the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, Japanese carrier air groups launched strike after strike that failed to reach their targets in effective strength. Part of the reason was the American Combat Air Patrol and radar-directed interception, but part of the reason was that Japanese aircraft were arriving at the fight already degraded. Planes that had been maintained on a break-and-fix basis, kept flying on the edge of their service limits, didn't perform at specification in a high-stress combat environment. Engines that were already stressed didn't climb as fast or sustain combat power as long. Guns that hadn't been serviced on a fixed schedule jammed at the wrong moment. American pilots, flying well-maintained aircraft from carriers where readiness rates held above 80%, weren't just better trained. They were fighting with tools that worked. Vice Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa launched over 430 aircraft in multiple waves that day. Fewer than 100 returned. American losses were under 30 planes from combat. The mismatch was so extreme that the result barely looked like a fair contest. It wasn't. Now here's the piece that makes the maintenance gap feel almost cruel in its irony. Japan started the war with arguably the best carrier aviators in the world. The pilots who struck Pearl Harbor in December 1941 had trained for years. Many had combat experience from China. They flew with precision, coordination, and tactical sophistication that American naval aviators couldn't match in the opening months of the conflict. But Japan's training pipeline was slow and elite. Building a carrier pilot took years. Losing one was nearly irreplaceable. And because Japan prioritized pilot quality over pilot quantity, the reserve pool was thin. The United States built the opposite system. American pilot training was designed for volume and speed without sacrificing baseline quality. The scale of the training effort was staggering. By 1944, the Army Air Forces alone were graduating more than 100,000 pilots per year. The naval aviation pipeline added tens of thousands more. Japan couldn't replace its losses. America couldn't stop replacing its losses. But here's what ties the pilot story back to maintenance. A well-maintained aircraft keeps its pilot alive longer. An aircraft that loses engine power at a critical moment, or whose guns jam during a firing pass, doesn't just fail the mission, it kills the pilot. Every maintenance failure was also a pilot retention failure. The Americans understood this connection explicitly. Ground crew chiefs were not support staff. They were considered integral to the combat effectiveness of their unit. A crew chief who kept his aircraft in perfect condition was as important to the squadron's kill ratio as the pilot who flew it. That cultural status mattered. It attracted capable men into maintenance roles and kept them motivated to perform. In the Army Air Forces, a crew chief typically bonded deeply with a specific aircraft and its pilot. The plane carried the crew chief's name on the fuselage alongside the pilot's. It was his machine, his record, his reputation. Japanese ground crew culture didn't carry that same individual ownership. Mechanics were assigned to units, not to specific aircraft. There was less personal stake in any one plane's condition. The emotional investment that drove American crew chiefs to work through the night, fixing a problem before a morning mission, simply operated differently in the Japanese system. This is the thing that was genuinely invisible to Japanese intelligence, and the reason that captured maintenance log left the Tokyo analyst baffled. You can count mechanics, you can count tools, you can count spare parts. You can't count the cultural architecture that tells a crew chief his career depends on that plane being ready at dawn. By 1945, the operational readiness gap had become so wide that it was structurally decisive. American air groups in the Pacific were launching with the majority of their available aircraft every single day. Japanese units were cannibalizing parts from grounded planes to keep others flying. A practice called controlled cannibalization in American doctrine, used sparingly and deliberately as a managed tool, but common in Japanese operations as a desperate improvisation. When you're cannibalizing aircraft regularly, you're not running a maintenance program anymore. You're running a slow liquidation of your Air Force. The numbers that shocked the Japanese intelligence officer in 1943 were, if anything, understated. By the time American forces were operating from the Mariana Islands in 1944 and 1944, readiness rates on some bomber groups running missions against the Japanese home islands were approaching 90%. The 20th Air Force, running Boeing B-29 Superfortress operations from the Marianas, tracked those numbers with the same intensity a surgeon tracks a patient's vitals. Each B-29 cost nearly $600,000 to produce. Each one required a crew of 11 men. Getting a B-29 to its target required that every one of its 4 Wright R-3350 engines was functioning correctly, that its pressurization system held, that its fire control systems worked, that its fuel management equipment performed. A B-29 that aborted a mission over Japan because a fuel transfer pump failed wasn't a tragedy. It was a maintenance failure that had been building for days. The Army Air Forces tracked aborts. They investigated them, they identified patterns, and they fixed those patterns in the technical orders that went out to every B-29 maintenance crew across the theater. Japan never had a system that could do that, and that, in the end, is what the Tokyo analyst was really looking at in those captured logs. He was looking at the output of a system that treated maintenance as a science, staffed by men who treated it as a profession in aircraft designed to make it possible. He thought he was looking at a clerical error. He was looking at the margin of victory. The Japanese Zero was, in many ways, the better aircraft in 1941. The Nakajima B-5N torpedo bomber that sank American battleships at Pearl Harbor was more capable than anything the United States Navy could put in the air against it on that morning. Technical superiority in the opening rounds is real, and it matters. But technical superiority measured at the factory gate is not the same thing as combat effectiveness measured at the airfield on a Tuesday morning in 1944. The United States won the air war in the Pacific, not just because it built more planes, though it built vastly more planes. It won because it built a system around those planes that kept them flying, kept them ready, and kept the men who maintained them skilled, motivated, and accountable. Japan's ground crews were never going to figure out the secret from a maintenance log. The log only showed the result. The cause was something you couldn't capture on paper. It was the whole way a nation decided to fight a war. If this kind of story interests you, there's more waiting in the next video.